The rain had been falling for 6 hours when Maren Solis found her. He almost didn't stop. The shape in the ditch off Route 9 looked like a deer at first, something large and broken, half submerged in the runoff channel that ran alongside the old county road. He'd been driving back from the clinic in Palermo with a cracked tail light and a car that needed new wiper blades, and the visibility was so bad he nearly missed it entirely. But something he couldn't name, some animal reflex that had no business living in a 34-year-old rural paramedic, told him to stop. He stopped. He walked back through the rain with his flashlight, and when the beam hit her, he stood very still for a long time. She was not a deer. She was not anything he had a word for. She lay on her side in the rushing water, one arm extended ahead of her, fingers splayed in the mud as if she had been trying to drag herself somewhere before she ran out of whatever was powering her. She was roughly humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head that tracked roughly to where heads were supposed to be, but the proportions were wrong in ways that his eyes kept sliding off of, like a painting with a detail the brain refuses to accept. Her skin was a pale gray-green, the color of lichen on a north-facing stone, and it had a faint luminescence to it that the rain kept washing out. Her hair, or what he took to be hair, was white and matted flat against a skull that was perhaps 30% too wide. Her clothing, if it was clothing, looked like it had been designed by someone who had read about the concept of clothing, but never seen it. Overlapping panels of a material he couldn't identify, torn now in several places. One large section on her left side burned or melted through to reveal a wound beneath that was leaking something amber. Her eyes were open. They were dark and enormous, almost no white at all, and they were watching him. He crouched down. He set the flashlight in the mud so it pointed up and made some light, and he held both his hands out, palms open, the way you do with a dog you don't know. "Hey," he said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She made a sound. It was not language, not any language, but it had the shape of language, the rhythm of it, and something in his chest responded to that rhythm before his brain could catch up. She was saying something. He didn't know what, but the sound of it was urgent and frightened and very, very tired. "Okay," he said, "okay, I've got you." He reached for her. She flinched, a full-body recoil that must have cost her enormously given the wound, and her eyes went wide and fixed on his hands, and her breathing changed to something rapid and shallow, and Maren understood in that moment, with the clarity you sometimes get in emergencies, that she expected him to kill her. She was looking at his hands, the way prey looks at a predator's teeth. "No," he said, and he didn't move his hands, but he kept them visible, kept them open. "No, I promise, no." She kept watching him. The amber fluid was running freely now, mixing with the rainwater, and whatever it was, she was running out of time. He could see the physiological signs even through the alien architecture: rapid, shallow respiration, systemic color change at the extremities, a tremor in the extended arm. She was going into shock. Whatever shock was for her species, she was going into it. He made a decision. He moved carefully, narrating every motion out loud even though she couldn't understand a word, because the tone of a voice is the same in every language that has ever evolved a throat and a need. He told her he was going to check the wound. He told her he wasn't going to pull anything out. He told her he was going to put pressure on it because that's what you do. He talked the whole time, a low, steady river of words, and after the first 30 seconds she stopped flinching. The wound was bad. Whatever had hit her, he could not begin to guess what had penetrated approximately 4 inches through that composite armor and into the tissue beneath. The tissue was different from human tissue in ways he cataloged automatically and set aside for later, denser, layered differently, a fibrous quality to the material surrounding the wound that suggested something more structured than muscle. But the physics of traumatic injury were the physics of traumatic injury. There was a hole. Things were coming out of the hole that needed to stay in. He needed to slow that down. He went back to his car and got his kit. He had a full trauma bag in the back always, a habit from 7 years of working rural roads where the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on a dry day. He came back. He knelt in the mud beside her and opened the bag, and she watched every movement he made with those enormous dark eyes. He couldn't use most of what was in the kit. He didn't know her biology. He didn't know if any of the medications would help or harm her, and the rule with unknown physiology is the same as the rule with unknown allergies. You do the mechanical work and you leave the chemistry alone. So he worked mechanically. He irrigated the wound with saline, she hissed but didn't pull away, and packed it with the hemostatic gauze, and bandaged it as well as the anatomy allowed, given that her torso was shaped somewhat differently than anything he had trained on. He worked quickly and methodically, and he talked the whole time. She watched him. By the time he finished, the tremor in her arm had reduced. Her breathing was still fast but less shallow. Whatever cascade of dying had been underway, he had interrupted it. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. She looked at him. "Can you walk?" he asked. He mimed it, a walking motion with 2 fingers, which in retrospect was the most absurd gesture he had ever made, but she seemed to understand it. She tilted her head, a motion that in her species apparently meant the same thing as in his, because she tried. She could not walk, not without help. He helped. It took 20 minutes to get her into his car, which was not designed for passengers with her particular proportions, and in that 20 minutes she went from passive and frightened to actively. He searched for the word and settled on curious. She was looking at everything. The car interior, his hands on the wheel, the dashboard, him. She kept coming back to him, those dark eyes moving across his face the way you look at something you recognize but cannot place. He drove her to his house. He did not drive her to a hospital because he did not know what a hospital would do with her, and he had the instinct, the same animal instinct that had made him stop the car, that whatever happened next, he needed to be the one deciding it. Her name, as best as he could render it in sounds his mouth was capable of making, was something like Varath. He learned this on the second day when she was stable enough to try communication, and the process of learning it took approximately 4 hours of the most intense and frustrating and oddly joyful work he had done in his life. She would make a sound and point at herself. He would try to repeat it. She would correct him. He would try again, repeat until the correction stopped coming. Then she would point at him. "Maren," he said. She tried it, Maren. "Close enough," he said. She looked at him for a long moment after that. He had the sense, not for the first time, that she was running calculations. He had set her up in his spare room, which had a bed she did not fit on correctly but had made work by folding the blankets in a way that apparently made sense to her. The wound was healing. He was shocked by how fast it was healing. By the end of the first day, the amber leaking had stopped. By the end of the second, the tissue around the bandage was visibly knitting, not scarring, not scabbing, but knitting, the edges of the wound drawing toward each other with a purposeful, architectural efficiency. He changed the dressing twice a day and watched it with the same fascination he'd had as a child watching time-lapse of plants growing. Biology doing what biology was designed to do, just faster, differently. The same principle scaled to a different chassis. He fed her. That was a complicated process of trial and error that produced its own vocabulary. The gesture for yes and the gesture for no. The system they developed for hot and cold and texture. The discovery that she could and would eat cooked rice, and something about his vegetable soup agreed with her. And the discovery that dairy products did something unpleasant to her that neither of them wanted to repeat. She watched him cook. She watched him eat. She watched him move around the kitchen in the slightly automatic way that people move in spaces they know by muscle memory, reaching for things without looking, his hands finding the right drawer, the right shelf, without consultation. She watched his hands a lot. On the third day she said something that had the shape and weight of a question, and she pointed at his hands, and he held them up and turned them over, palms up, palms down, showing her nothing was hidden. She reached out slowly, telegraphing every inch of the movement, and touched his wrist, just above the pulse point. And she held it there, and her eyes went slightly unfocused, and the expression on her face did something he couldn't read but felt, the way you feel music in your sternum. He let her. She sat like that for almost a minute, her fingers on his pulse, eyes somewhere else entirely. Then she withdrew her hand and looked at him with an expression that, across all the species difference, across all the biological and cultural distance, he recognized. He recognized it because he'd seen it in the mirror once, years ago, when he'd been looking at a scan of a patient and found something that shouldn't have been there, something that changed what he thought he understood. She looked at him the way he had looked at that scan. Like the world had just rearranged itself into a shape that was both impossible and, somehow, inevitable. Her ship was in the woods 3 kilometers north of where he'd found her. She told him this on the 4th day, or rather she drew him a map using the condensation on the window and a sequence of gestures and sounds until he understood. He hiked out to it in the morning and found it half buried in a hillside, camouflaged by something that wasn't quite invisibility, but was close enough that he nearly walked past it twice even knowing it was there. It was smaller than he'd imagined, roughly the size of a school bus, teardrop-shaped, made of a material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was also badly damaged. He was not an aerospace engineer. But the section that corresponded to what he guessed was the propulsion system looked the way an engine block looks when something has gone very wrong inside it, deformed, partially melted, wrong in the specific way that wrong things are when forces have been applied that they weren't designed for. The impact crater in the hillside told him the landing had not been intentional. He came back and reported this to her using the vocabulary they had assembled between them. She listened. She asked several questions he mostly understood by now. Then she was quiet for a long time. He made tea. He put a cup in front of her, which she had started drinking on day 2 because apparently something in the chemistry agreed with her in the same way dairy did not. She wrapped both hands around the cup and was quiet. He didn't push. He had learned in 7 years of emergency medicine, and in 4 days with her specifically, that silence is sometimes the most useful thing available. Eventually she began to talk. It took a long time. Their vocabulary was still limited, and some of what she said required elaborate workarounds. But what he understood, assembled slowly from pieces, was something like this. She had come from a long way away. Her people knew about Earth. They had known for a long time. She indicated a duration he interpreted as centuries by the context. They had assessed it, assessed humanity, found it primitive by the metrics they used to measure such things. Her people were old and technically advanced, and they had a system for classifying civilizations they encountered, and humans ranked low on that system. And so Earth had been marked as a kind of, she searched for the gesture, and landed on something he interpreted as watched, observed but not engaged with, a place they tracked but did not consider relevant. She was here specifically because of a research assignment. She was a scientist of some kind. He caught the word she used for herself, and it didn't map cleanly to anything, something between researcher and recorder and archivist. She had been cataloging something about Earth, though the specifics of what, exactly, kept sliding away from their shared vocabulary. Her craft had been damaged not by malfunction, but by something else. Something had hit her. She didn't say what, but the way she said it, or rather the way she shaped her silence around it, made him understand that whatever had happened was not an accident. Someone had done it. "Your people?" he asked. She shook her head, not his people's doing, but she didn't say whose. He let it go for now. "Can you fix the ship?" he asked. A long pause, then, "Some things, not everything. The part that moves it," she made a gesture he'd come to associate with the concept of broken beyond repair. "I need to send a signal, But if I send a signal, they will know where I am. They, he said, the ones who hit you. She looked at him, she nodded. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, okay, we'll figure it out, not today. Today you rest. She looked at him for a long time. That calculating look again, that reading a scan look. Why, she said. It was one of the first words she'd mastered. She used it precisely, and she used it now as precisely as a scalpel. Why what? Why, she gestured at him, at the room, at the bandaging, at the tea, at all of it. Why, you help. He thought about it honestly. He was a man who believed in answering questions honestly when they were asked honestly. I don't know how not to, he said. On the 7th day, she told him what she had found. She had been mapping human genetic markers for her research. That was the cataloging he had not been able to understand, translated now through a week of accumulated vocabulary. Her civilization had done this centuries ago, and she was doing a follow-up survey, checking how the markers had drifted, what had persisted, what had died out. Routine archival work. But she had found something that was not supposed to be there. Or rather, something that was supposed to be gone. She had been mapping population distribution of a specific cluster of markers. An ancient sequence, extremely old by human standards, that her people had first documented 600 years ago in a specific region of southern Asia. At the time of that first documentation, the sequence had been present in a small population. A monk, a teacher, records suggested, who had spread both knowledge and apparently something else along various trade routes before the lineage was lost to history. Her people had considered the sequence extinct. It was not extinct. It was rare, very rare, present in perhaps a few hundred individuals globally, diluted and dormant through generations of interbreeding expressed in none of them, but present, a sleeping thing carried in the blood, waiting for conditions that hadn't arrived. Conditions, she told him carefully, that she had spent 2 years researching the nature of. He had been listening carefully, and now a small stillness settled over him. Why were you looking for me specifically, he asked, that night on that road? Her eyes met his. Maren, she said, and then a sequence of sounds he was not yet fluent enough to parse, but whose meaning he understood from the way she looked at him. His name was in her records. She had tracked the sequence to this county. She had been on her way to locate the individual carrying the strongest expression of the dormant markers when her ship was hit. What does it do? He asked. The sequence, what is it for? She thought for a long time about how to explain it. Your people, she began. A very long time ago, before your history that you write down, your people were different, the way you think, the way your body knows things without being told. You could, she paused, frustrated with the vocabulary gap. The body knows the enemy before the eyes see it. The hands know the right motion before the brain decides. The mind can hold the thing. She made a gesture that encompassed vastness, all of the thing at once without it falling apart. Instinct, he said. She shook her head, more. She tried again. She described a state in which the body's systems, neurological, immunological, proprioceptive, operated in concert at a level of integration that modern human neuroscience hadn't mapped because it hadn't known to look for it. A state in which pattern recognition was so deep it operated below consciousness. A state in which the immune system could be directed, consciously, the way a muscle could be directed. A state in which the full computational capacity of the human organism, normally running at a fraction of its potential due to the noise of modern overstimulation, could be briefly, brilliantly focused. A human body running at its actual design specifications. Your people had this, she said. The one who was the source of the markers you carry, he had this. He passed it on. Over 600 years it diluted. The world your people built made it go silent because you never needed it and you never knew you had it. She looked at him steadily. But the code is still there. In you, it has not disappeared. It is waiting. For what? He said. For someone to wake it up, she said. He was quiet. Outside, a bird called once and stopped. "And the people who shot down your ship," he said carefully, "they know about this sequence too." She nodded very slowly. "They don't want it woken up," she said. Her name for the ones who had shot her down translated approximately as those who decide what others are worth. They were not her people. They were a third party, older than her civilization by a considerable margin, self-appointed arbiters of something they called developmental ceiling, which she explained with visible distaste as an assessment of the maximum a civilization could be expected to achieve. They monitored civilizations. They designated ceilings. And when something appeared that might exceed what they had designated, they intervened. "They've done this before," Maren said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him with that expression again. "Yes." "To how many civilizations?" A pause. "Many." "And nobody stopped them." "Who would?" she said quietly. "They are very old, they are very fast, they have had a very long time to become very good at what they do, and mostly," she paused, "mostly the civilizations they designate do not know it is happening. They think their own ceilings are natural. They think the limit is theirs." Maren thought about the history of human civilization and what it had accomplished, and also what it had never quite managed to accomplish, and thought about a 600-year-old monk's bloodline going silent in the noise of the modern world, and felt something in him go cold and very clear. "How long do we have?" he asked. "They know I am on the planet," she said. "My ship's impact, they will have detected it. They know the sequence is still present. I had transmitted preliminary survey data before I was hit. They will come to finish what they started. And if they find you here with me, they'll know you found the source." "Yes." "And they'll kill us both." "Yes." He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the woods, at the old Douglas firs that had been standing there since before he was born, at the light coming through them, the way it had come through them every morning of his life on this piece of land. "You came here to find me," he said. "Before the crash, before all of this, you came here because of what I carry." "Yes." "Can you wake it, the sequence? Can you do what you were researching?" A long silence. "I believe so," she said carefully. "I was developing a method. It is not certain. The sequence has been dormant for many generations, and the process," she paused. "It will be difficult. For you, physically, the integration your body will undergo, there is no precedent in living memory. The last human who experienced full expression of the sequence died 600 years ago, and the records of what it was like are," she paused, "incomplete. But you think it'll work. I think you are the strongest expression of the dormant markers I have ever recorded," she said quietly. "And I believe, that whatever your ancestor was, you are closer to it than any human now living. The potential is there. The question is only whether you are willing to endure what waking it requires." He turned from the window. "When do we start?" he said. The process was nothing like he expected. He had imagined something dramatic, lights, machines, a transformation scene with a beginning and an end. What she described, and then what he experienced, was nothing like that. It was closer to physiotherapy. It was closer to learning to hear a frequency you had always been able to hear but had never been in quiet enough to notice. She worked with him for 3 days. She used a device from her ship, something small and smooth that hummed at frequencies he felt in his teeth and behind his eyes. She used specific postures and breathing patterns she had learned from her research into the original lineage's practices, traditions that had been preserved in fragmentary records her civilization had archived from ancient texts. She used sleep deprivation in careful calibrated intervals. She used immersion in cold water. She used silence. She monitored his biomarkers constantly, and on the second day she told him, with a careful neutrality that he read correctly as suppressed excitement, that something was responding. The baseline data she had recorded on day 1 was changing. His cortisol response time had decreased by 40%. His reaction time, tested with a simple device she rigged from components of her ship, had dropped from normal human range to something she would not say a number for but described, with the closest thing to awe he had seen on her face, as unusual. On the third day, he woke at 3 in the morning, with a feeling he had no word for. It wasn't pain. It was more like pressure, a systemic pressure, as if something inside him had been folded small for a very long time and was now slowly, carefully, impossibly unfolding. He lay on his back in the dark and breathed and felt it happening and did not panic, because somewhere in the process of the last 3 days he had moved past the part of him that was afraid of this. He lay there and felt himself become, incrementally, more. By morning he could hear the deer in the woods 300 yards east of the house before he saw them. Not through any supernatural faculty. He heard the soft displacement of undergrowth, the specific interval of their footfalls, and his brain assembled the information into a picture before his eyes confirmed it. He had always had good hearing, but this was different. This was his hearing talking to something else, some integrating faculty he hadn't known to use, and the two things together produced a clarity that felt almost like a new sense. He told Vareth. She looked at his face for a moment and then looked quickly away, and he understood she was trying to maintain scientific objectivity and was finding it difficult. "There is more," she said. "This is the beginning." "I know," he said. On the 4th day after they began, she found the signal. They were going to arrive in approximately 16 hours. He spent those 16 hours very deliberately. He went to his workshop and gathered specific tools. He walked the woods around his property and the fields, learning them again with the new acuity, mapping every significant feature. He made phone calls, 3 of them, brief and to specific people, conversations that sounded like nothing to anyone listening, but conveyed exactly what he needed to convey. He cooked a large meal. He and Vareth ate together, and somewhere in the eating he realized that the communication between them had shifted, not that they had more vocabulary, but that he was reading her more completely. The micro-expressions, the postural language, the rhythms of her breathing that mapped to internal states. He was processing her the way he had processed the deer in the woods, the way his body now processed everything, more completely, more quietly, more true. She was afraid. Not for herself. He understood this with a certainty that the old version of him would have called intuition and would have doubted. She was afraid for him. She had been afraid for him since the first night, since he'd crouched in the rain and held his hands out, palms up. "You knew," he said over dinner. "When you touched my wrist that first time, you knew what I carried, and you were afraid." She considered denying it. He watched her consider and discard the option. "Yes," she said. "Because of what waking it would cost." "Yes." "But you told me anyway." "Yes." He looked at her. "Why?" She was quiet for a long time. "Because," she said finally, with the careful construction of someone working in their second language and wanting to be exact, "I have studied what your civilization has done, what your people have achieved in the conditions you have had, with the ceiling they imposed on you. I have looked at your history. I have read your records. You should not have survived. By every metric my civilization uses, you should not have made it through your first 200 years of industrial technology. The probability of your survival to this point, given what you were dealing with, is," she paused. "My people do not have a word for a probability so small. We have a word for things that should not exist, and yet do." She looked at him. "I thought when I began this research that the sequence was a curiosity, an anomaly, an artifact, and then I found you, and I sat in my ship for 6 days before I flew to this county because I understood what it would mean if I was right, what it would mean for everything." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the firs. "And are you right?" he asked. She looked at his hands. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "after tonight." They came at 3 a.m. He knew they were coming before any instrument registered it. He knew the way he knew the deer in the woods, some assembly of fractional signals, gravitational, pressure, electromagnetic, that his body cataloged and integrated before his conscious mind received the report. He was standing in the clearing north of his house when their vehicle descended. It was larger than Varath's ship. It moved with the confidence of something that had never learned to be cautious. It settled into the field with the unhurried certainty of a thing that had done this many times. 3 of them came out. They were not what he had imagined from Varath's description. They looked almost human, close enough that at a distance, in poor light, you might not notice the difference. But the light was good, because Maren had made sure of that, and they were not human. Their movements were too calibrated. Their eyes were too flat. They had the absolute stillness of things that did not need to manage an inner state because they did not have one. One of them spoke. It was not a language Maren knew, but the meaning was carried in other channels, in posture, in spatial positioning, in the specific way they arranged themselves around him. The meaning was, "We know what you are. We know what has been done. Give her up and this ends cleanly." Maren was quiet for a moment. He could feel everything. He could feel the specific weight of the air, the temperature gradient between the forest and the clearing, the 3 of them and their positioning relative to each other and to him, and to the distances they assumed were safe. He could feel the heartbeat of the woman behind him, inside the tree line, watching. He could feel something else, something vast and old, unfolding in his blood, recognizing this situation with a familiarity that had nothing to do with his personal history, and everything to do with a lineage that stretched back through 1,000 years of forgetting to a man who had stood in different clearings, and understood different enemies, and known exactly what to do. He thought of that man. He had never known his name. He would never know his name. But he understood now, with the complete and certain clarity that the last several days had given him, that the man had passed something forward through the centuries with intention. That every generation that had carried it, dormant, unknowing, was a link in something deliberate. That the forgetting had been forced, external, the work of exactly the kind of thing that was standing in front of him now. And that the waking was a kind of reunion. He moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes, he could never fully explain to anyone afterward. Not because he couldn't remember. He remembered everything, in extraordinary detail, with a clarity he had never had before and would apparently always have now. But because the description required a framework that the people he might explain it to didn't share. He moved through the clearing and they responded, and he anticipated each response before it arrived and positioned himself accordingly. He used the terrain he had memorized. He used the dark. He used specific principles of leverage and force that his body now understood not as learned technique, but as something closer to mother tongue. He had the advantage of biology. He had a body that was running, finally, as it had been designed to run, the product of 1,000,000 years of evolution that had never been fully expressed in any human alive, because something had always been in the way. He also had the advantage of surprise. They had assessed him, the way their kind always assessed things, by the metrics they used to assess things, by their designated ceiling. They had looked at him and seen a primitive, and in looking for a primitive they had not been looking for what he actually was. That was always the mistake. Looking at the thing in front of you, and seeing only what you expected to see. 3 minutes and 40 seconds after it began, it was over. He stood in the clearing. He was bleeding from a cut along his left forearm, where one of them had managed a single contact. He didn't feel it. He was breathing hard, but not as hard as he should have been. The 3 of them were on the ground in various states of incapacitated, and their vehicle was no longer operational because, in the 40 hours since he'd learned it was coming, he had also learned, from Varath, where to hit it. He stood in the field under the stars, and felt the vast old thing settle back into quiet readiness. Varath came out of the trees. She walked across the field slowly. She stopped a few meters from him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him from the ditch, but the proportions of it had changed entirely. The fear was still there, but it was not the fear of someone who expects to be hurt. It was the fear of someone standing next to something enormous and ancient and suddenly, terribly awake. "We need to deal with them," he said. He kept his voice level. He felt very calm. "And we need to figure out how to get a message out, not your civilization, not theirs, something neutral. Is there something neutral?" She blinked. She was still looking at him with that expression. "Vareth," he said gently, "is there a neutral party we can contact?" She came back to herself. "Yes," she said. "There is a council, observational. They do not take sides, but they record. If they record what happened tonight, what exists, what was suppressed, then the suppression becomes official record," he said. "It becomes hard to continue quietly." "Yes," she paused. "It will not end everything. It is a first step. There are more of them, those who decide, many more, and they have done this to many civilizations," he said. "I know, but we start somewhere." He looked at the sky, enormous and ordinary, full of stars that did not know his name. "Get me in contact with this council," he said. "Let's have a conversation they weren't expecting." He did not become someone else. This was the thing he tried to explain, in the days and weeks that followed, to the people who needed to understand it. The 3 phone calls he had made during those 16 hours of preparation had been to people he trusted, a former colleague, a woman he had worked with in the field for 4 years, a man who had served in a capacity he had never explained fully, and whose judgment Maren had learned to rely on in the specific way you rely on someone who has been shot at with you. He had not told them much. He had told them enough. By the time Vareth's transmission reached the observational council, there were 7 humans who knew what had happened in that field, and all 7 understood what it meant. Not just what it meant for Maren specifically, what it meant for the species. The council's response took 11 days. When it came in a form Vareth hadn't expected. A formal inquiry with subpoena-equivalent authority over the organization that had shot her down, and a request for testimony. Her testimony, his testimony, and the biological data she had spent 2 years collecting. "They've never issued one of these before," she told him, holding the transmission readout, her face doing the thing he had come to recognize as her version of shock. "Not for a Class 5 world. Not for," she stopped. "Not for a human." "First time for everything," he said. He was in the kitchen. He was making tea. The motion was the same motion it had always been, reaching for the kettle, filling it, setting it on the burner. But the quality of it was different now. Everything was different now. All the same motion suffused with a clarity and a completeness he was still getting used to. He didn't think he would ever fully get used to it. He wasn't sure he was supposed to. She sat down at the kitchen table. She watched him move. "Your ancestor," she said, "the one from 600 years ago. Do you know anything about him?" He thought of the fragments his mother had mentioned once, from an old family story she'd half remembered from her grandmother, who had half remembered it from hers. Something about a teacher, something about a long journey, something about a man who had known things people couldn't explain, and had spent his life giving those things away. "A little," he said. "The records my civilization has are fragmentary," she said. "But there is one consistent thread across them." He knew at the end. He understood that what he had would be targeted, that the lineage would be hunted. He chose not to fight for himself. He chose to distribute it instead, as widely as he could, across as many bloodlines as possible, so that it could not be entirely extinguished. Maren poured the water. "He gambled," he said. "He planned," she said. "He planned for someone someday to wake up. He planned for the conditions that would allow it, and she paused. He trusted his species, even knowing what they were capable of, even knowing how long it might take. He trusted that eventually a human would be in the right moment and choose the right thing. He brought the tea to the table. He set a cup in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it the way she always did. He sat across from her. Outside the window, the firs were moving in the early morning wind, the same wind that moved through them every morning, the same light coming through in the same ancient way. Birds were calling somewhere in the middle distance. The world was exactly what it had always been. And nothing was the same at all. He wasn't wrong, Maren said. She looked at him. She had been afraid of him since the first night, in many different ways and for many different reasons. He could read all of them now. He could read the fear that was not fear but something adjacent to it, the feeling you have when you encounter something you have built your entire worldview without accounting for and must now revise. He had felt that feeling himself recently. No, she said quietly. He was not wrong. The tea steamed between them. The light moved. Somewhere 300 yards east in the old stand of Douglas fir, a deer stepped carefully through the underbrush, and Maren heard its footfall and its weight and its exact distance, and he did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say. It was just the world talking to him. He had only learned, finally, to listen.